The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the Washington, D.C. skyline, casting a warm glow over the city's gleaming buildings. The streets were quieter than usual as the evening drew near, but the capital city never seemed to rest. Just a short walk from the White House, in a sleek apartment filled with pristine white furniture and sharp modern accents, Karoline Leavitt stood before a mirror, adjusting her navy blue blazer. At 27, she had already broken records. As the youngest press secretary in White House history, she had become the face of the administration, the one tasked with navigating the tricky waters of public opinion, politics, and the media. Today, however, it wasn't just about appearances or public statements. Karoline's mind wandered, though she couldn't quite figure out why. Perhaps it was because of the silver cross on her blazer's collar, a small, almost imperceptible symbol, but one she never took off. Her grandmother had given it to her when she was just a child. It had always represented faith, heritage, and the strength to remain grounded. But now, standing here in her office, it felt heavy, as if it was carrying a weight she hadn't anticipated. Her phone buzzed, its shrill ring slicing through the silence. Karoline grabbed it, expecting the usual texts or emails, but her heart skipped when she saw the caller ID, President Trump. "Karoline," Trump's voice crackled through the line, urgent as always. "I need you to head over to the local court right now. There's a religious freedom case, a group of Christians suing because they're being banned from praying in public spaces. I want you to observe it and report back to me as soon as possible." It was a sharp turn in her day, and Karoline's instincts told her this wasn't going to be an ordinary assignment. The president's tone was more than just political, it was personal. Religious freedom was a hot-button issue, and Karoline knew that in this case, the stakes were higher than they appeared. Her own faith was something she rarely discussed publicly, but it was a significant part of who she was. Now, it felt like the court was calling her to confront that very part of herself. "Understood, Mr. President," she replied, keeping her voice steady, despite the swirling emotions within her. "I'll head over immediately." She hung up the phone, took one last look at her immaculate apartment, and grabbed her leather bag. Her blazer was crisp, her black pants fitted and sharp. She looked the part. But it wasn't about the clothes today. It was about what was coming next, the case, the courtroom, the conflict that she knew was inevitable. The drive to the courthouse was quick, as always, but today it felt different. The usual noise of traffic seemed muted in her mind. She couldn't help but think about the implications of the case, the potential for controversy. There had been whispers about the growing divide in the country, about the increasing clashes between personal freedoms and legal boundaries. Karoline had always walked a fine line in her job, but this felt like walking a tightrope. By the time she parked in front of the D.C. local court, the air had changed. There was a buzz around the building, not just the usual hum of legal proceedings but a palpable energy in the air. She couldn't quite place it, but she could feel it. The crowd outside was a mixture of onlookers, reporters, and people whose names she didn't recognize. Inside the courtroom, the tension would surely be even more intense. Karoline pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the courthouse. The moment she entered, the familiar smell of polished wood, faintly mixed with the scent of old paper, hit her. The bustling noise from the outer hall faded as she walked through, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. The room was filled with people, waiting for their turn before the judge. There was a cacophony of murmurs, citizens waiting for minor cases, hoping for swift resolutions to mundane issues. A man wearing a "I am king" t-shirt fiddled with his phone. A woman next to him wore a necklace so large it seemed out of place, almost absurd in its extravagance. The dress code here was clearly not enforced. Karoline took a seat in the middle of the courtroom, the hard wooden chair pressing uncomfortably against her back. She pulled out her phone, opened the document she'd been preparing for the case, and began jotting down notes. Despite the surrounding noise, she found it oddly calming. The silver cross on her blazer's collar gleamed beneath the fluorescent lighting, but Karoline didn't notice it. Her mind was elsewhere, already preparing for the next steps. The door at the back of the room opened, and the judge walked in. His presence was commanding. Judge Charles Hargrove, 62 years old, a man whose reputation for strictness preceded him, entered the room with an air of authority. His black robe was pressed perfectly, and his salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back. As he took his seat, the room fell silent. "All rise," the bailiff, James Wilson, announced in a voice that brooked no argument. Everyone stood. Karoline, too, rose from her seat, phone still in hand. She surveyed the room, her eyes catching on the judge. He scanned the room quickly, his sharp eyes taking in the faces of the people gathered before him. His expression was one of cool detachment, the kind of professionalism that came with decades of experience. He sat down behind the bench, his eyes narrowing as he looked over the cases in front of him. The first case was simple, a man who had parked in the wrong spot. He was fined $50, and the judge moved on without a second thought. There were more cases after that, people being warned for overdue rent, disputes between neighbors, all typical matters for a courtroom. Karoline observed the proceedings closely, making notes of any potential angles for her report back to the president. But then, as the judge called out the next case, something unexpected happened. "Miss Leavitt," Judge Hargrove's voice rang out, suddenly cutting through the silence. Karoline froze. He had noticed her, or perhaps recognized her. The room, which had been murmuring quietly, now fell silent. "Yes, Your Honor," Karoline replied, standing up, her heart quickening slightly. She had expected to be left alone in the back row, observing the proceedings, but now the spotlight was on her. "What's that on your collar?" Hargrove asked, his voice sharp, almost accusatory. Karoline glanced down at her blazer, her fingers brushing the cross. "It's a silver cross, Your Honor. A personal item, a part of my faith." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, and Karoline could see his jaw tighten. "This is a courtroom, not a place for displays of personal belief," he stated coldly. "You're not here to preach or to make a statement." "I'm not preaching, Your Honor," Karoline replied, her voice even but firm. "I'm here to observe a case, as requested by the President. This is simply a personal item, nothing more." Hargrove's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, his eyes narrowed, as if trying to decide whether to pursue this further. "The courtroom is a neutral space, Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice tight. "Religious symbols have no place here." Karoline's breath caught in her throat. She had expected some discomfort, but she hadn't anticipated this level of hostility. Her mind raced, but her response was measured. "I'm not violating any rule, Your Honor. This is protected under the First Amendment." A smirk tugged at the judge's lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You think the Constitution protects your right to wear that in my courtroom?" Karoline's heart hammered in her chest. This wasn't just about a cross, it was about a much larger issue. She felt the weight of the moment, of the hundreds of people in the courtroom who were silently observing. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, standing tall, her voice clear and unwavering. "I do." Hargrove's face flushed with anger, and the gavel came down with a resounding bang. "I'm fining you $500 for contempt of court," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You will pay that before you leave." The crowd murmured in disbelief. Karoline stood perfectly still, her mind spinning. She had known the stakes were high, but she hadn't expected this kind of direct confrontation. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her, the weight of their judgment. Karoline took a slow, deliberate breath. The room's silence pressed against her like a heavy fog. The fine was ridiculous, a clear overreach from a judge who was too focused on her personal beliefs to care about the law. But Karoline wasn't someone to back down. She had spent years in the spotlight, navigating tricky political situations with finesse, but this was different. This was personal. She wasn't going to let a judge dictate the rules for her faith. "I'll pay the fine, Your Honor," Karoline said, her voice steady, yet her hands tightened around her phone. "But we are not done here. I demand an explanation. I deserve one." The crowd held its breath, and for a moment, Karoline thought she saw a flicker of uncertainty cross the judge's face, quickly masked by a scowl. He banged his gavel again, the sound sharp and forceful, but it did little to quell the tension in the room. "You've made your point," Hargrove replied coldly. "But you've crossed the line, and now you'll pay for it, $500, and that's final." Karoline glanced around the courtroom. People were whispering among themselves. The man in the "I am king" t-shirt was shaking his head, his phone still clutched in his hand, and the woman with the oversized necklace was now glaring at the judge, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events. It was obvious that others in the room were starting to see the injustice of it, even if they hadn't voiced it. "I don't think you understand, Your Honor," Karoline said, her voice calm but tinged with a quiet authority. "You're not punishing me for breaking a rule. You're punishing me because you don't like what I stand for." Judge Hargrove's expression darkened. He stood, gripping his gavel tightly, clearly losing patience. "You will not lecture me in my courtroom," he snapped. "Sit down, Miss Leavitt." Karoline didn't sit. Instead, she took a step forward, her eyes locked on his. The silver cross on her blazer's collar gleamed under the fluorescent lights, almost as though it were a challenge. "I am not lecturing you, Your Honor. I'm asking for the same treatment everyone else here gets. I want to see the written rule. I want to know what law I've broken. If I'm being fined, should know why." The judge was silent for a moment, as though considering her words. The gavel in his hand hovered above the desk, and his eyes narrowed, calculating the next move. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he said, finally slamming the gavel down one last time. "The fine stands." The crowd was now whispering openly. Some people were muttering under their breath, clearly uncomfortable with how this was unfolding. One older man in the back row shook his head in disbelief, while the young woman with the oversized necklace whispered to her lawyer, her expression one of bewilderment. Karoline stood still, her posture unyielding. She knew this wasn't just about her. This wasn't even about the cross. This was about standing up to a system that allowed this kind of injustice to go unchecked. She felt the weight of her responsibility settle on her shoulders like a mantle she had no choice but to carry. "I'll pay the fine," Karoline said again, more firmly this time. "But I'm not going to let this go. This isn't the way things are supposed to work." Judge Hargrove's eyes flickered with annoyance, and he leaned forward, as if preparing for another attack. "You'll pay it and leave," he said, his voice low but intense. "And we'll move on with the session." But Karoline wasn't ready to back down just yet. "No, sir. You don't get to dismiss this. Not like this," she said. Her voice cut through the silence in the courtroom, sharp as a blade. "You're targeting me because of my faith. But I have the right to wear this. And if you want to fine me for it, you'll have to show me the law that says I can't. Until then, this case is not over." For the first time, Karoline saw doubt flash in Hargrove's eyes. He was stalling, grasping for control of the situation that was quickly slipping out of his hands. His grip on the gavel tightened, and for a brief moment, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. The murmurs grew louder, and more eyes turned toward Karoline, watching her with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Hargrove's face flushed with frustration. "You're pushing this too far, Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't test me." Karoline's heart was pounding, but her mind was clear. She had to finish what she had started. "You're the one testing me, Your Honor," she said. "I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here to do my job." But if you want to make a statement, I'm willing to meet you halfway. Judge Hargrove was silent for a moment, and then his lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. You'll pay the fine. You'll leave. And we'll forget this ever happened. If you push me any further, it'll be you who'll regret it. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, but Karoline stood tall, unflinching. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She knew that if she let him win, it wouldn't just be a personal loss, it would be a loss for everyone who believed in standing up for their rights. I'm not backing down, Your Honor, she said quietly, her voice carrying across the room. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been silenced for standing up for what they believe in. Hargrove's hand shook slightly as he lifted the gavel, ready to bring it down again. But this time, the room was different. The crowd wasn't watching in silence anymore. There was a sense of defiance in the air, a shift in the balance of power. Karoline had turned the tables. I'm reporting this, she said firmly. I'll make sure the White House knows exactly what's happening here today. The room seemed to hold its breath. Karoline's words hung in the air, charged with finality. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore, she was standing up for everyone who had ever faced discrimination for their faith, their beliefs, or their right to be heard. Judge Hargrove stood frozen for a moment, his hand still poised above the gavel. He had never been challenged like this before. He had never been made to feel so small in his own courtroom. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Karoline's steady breathing. Finally, with a shaky exhale, Hargrove slammed the gavel down, his voice cracking. $500, he muttered. And you'll pay it before you leave. But Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She stood her ground, knowing that this moment, this very instance, had the power to change something bigger than just her. It was about the system. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. I'll pay it, she said, her voice ringing with authority. But you'll remember this day, Your Honor. You'll remember it. As she turned to leave, the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Whispers of support followed her as she walked out of the courtroom, the silver cross gleaming defiantly under the bright lights. Outside, the evening air felt different, charged, almost electric. Karoline's heart was still racing, but she knew this was far from over. This was only the beginning. The media would catch wind of this. The story would spread, and it wouldn't be long before the public caught on. Karoline wasn't just a spokesperson anymore. She was a symbol. A symbol of resistance, of faith, and of the courage to stand up when the system tried to silence you. As she walked to her car, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from the White House communications team. Karoline, the text read, "We've got your back. Prepare for a statement. We're taking this all the way." A small smile tugged at Karoline's lips as she opened the car door. The battle wasn't over, but she was ready. She had just begun to fight. As Karoline slid into the front seat of her sleek black SUV, the weight of the moment still hung heavy in the air. Her heart was racing, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had done what many would have thought impossible, she had stood her ground in the face of authority. But she knew this battle wasn't over. The fine, the defiant stance she had taken in front of the judge, the gathering storm of whispers in the courtroom, it was all part of something much bigger than just a courtroom confrontation. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced down. It was a message from the White House communications team. "Karoline," it began, "the president wants a statement. The public needs to know what happened today. Prepare for a press briefing. This will get out there fast." The urgency in the message told Karoline everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was an opportunity to push for change, to expose what she knew was wrong and to make sure people saw the injustice for what it truly was. As she started the engine, her mind raced. The fine, the courtroom, Hargrove's arrogant dismissal of her rights, it was all part of a larger picture. She had stood there, defiant, in front of a judge who had tried to silence her. But it was bigger than that. It was about the principle of freedom. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the system seemed stacked against you. The next morning, the news was everywhere. White House press secretary fined $500 for wearing cross in courtroom, a shocking case of religious intolerance. The headlines blared across social media. The hashtag #CrossInCourt was trending, and thousands of people were sharing the story of how Karoline had stood up to Judge Hargrove. The footage of the courtroom, taken from a discreet angle by someone in the audience, went viral. People were watching as Karoline stood her ground, her voice steady and resolute as she defied the judge's unreasonable demands. At the White House, the phone lines were buzzing with calls from reporters, supporters, and even lawmakers. They wanted to know more about what had happened. They wanted to hear Karoline's side of the story. She could feel the eyes of the world on her as she entered the briefing room that afternoon. The cameras were already set up, the reporters seated, their eager faces fixed on her. As she walked to the podium, the room fell silent. The cross on her blazer gleamed brightly under the lights, a visible symbol of her faith and her determination. This was her moment. "Good afternoon," Karoline began, her voice clear and confident, yet calm. "I know you all have questions about what happened in the D.C. local court yesterday. I'm here to give you the facts, and I'm here to tell you that this wasn't just about a cross. It was about standing up for our rights, for our beliefs, and for the freedoms we hold dear in this country." She paused for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. The room was quiet, waiting for her to continue. "Yesterday, I was fined for wearing a religious symbol in a courtroom. Not because I violated any rules, but because a judge chose to target me for my faith. Let me be clear, this is not just about one person, and it's not just about a single case. This is about a broader issue, an issue where people are silenced for expressing their beliefs. An issue where religious freedom is being attacked." Karoline's words were firm, her gaze steady as she looked out at the sea of reporters in front of her. She knew the weight of her words. She knew this wasn't just a press briefing, it was a rallying cry for those who felt voiceless, for those who had been persecuted for their faith. The questions began to come fast and furious. Some reporters tried to frame it as a minor legal matter, a simple misunderstanding, while others asked if she planned to take legal action against Judge Hargrove. Karoline calmly answered each one, making it clear that this wasn't a personal vendetta, it was a stand for religious liberty. "I've already filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Council," she said when asked if she was taking legal action. "This isn't just about me, this is about ensuring that no one else faces the kind of treatment I did. The law is supposed to protect our rights, not punish us for what we believe." Outside, the media storm was just beginning. Social media was flooded with tweets, videos, and posts. People were rallying behind her, sharing their own experiences of facing discrimination for their religious beliefs. The hashtag #CrossInCourt was gaining momentum by the minute, with people from all walks of life using it to voice their support. At the same time, a growing number of voices were coming out in support of Judge Hargrove. Critics accused Karoline of making a spectacle out of a simple court ruling. Some suggested that her actions were a political move, designed to spark outrage and gain favor with conservative voters. But those voices were drowned out by the growing chorus of support for Karoline's stand. It didn't take long before President Trump weighed in. His tweet read, "Karoline Leavitt, my amazing spokesperson, just showed the left how it's done. Religious freedom is untouchable in this country. We won't back down." The tweet was shared thousands of times, and the media coverage escalated to new heights. At the same time, the Judicial Council had already begun its investigation into Judge Hargrove's actions. Karoline knew that the battle wasn't just about her anymore, it was about sending a message that no one, no matter how powerful, could impose their personal beliefs on the law. As the days passed, the pressure on Judge Hargrove grew. News outlets dug into his record, uncovering past instances where he had fined or reprimanded people for wearing religious symbols, specifically Christian ones. His pattern of biased rulings was becoming clear, and the Judicial Council was forced to take action. Hargrove was suspended pending an investigation, and it became apparent that the public pressure had played a significant role in that decision. Karoline's phone buzzed again as she sat in her office at the White House. It was a message from Linda Martinez, the lead investigator with the D.C. Judicial Council. "Hargrove's been suspended. We're pushing for reforms. This won't be swept under the rug." Karoline smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She had done it. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told their faith didn't belong in public spaces. The battle wasn't over, but the first steps toward change had been taken. The story of Karoline Leavitt's stand against Judge Hargrove spread across the country. It became a symbol of courage, a reminder that one person could make a difference, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. People from all walks of life were inspired by her unwavering resolve, and soon, state courts across the country began reviewing their own policies on religious symbols and expressions. Months later, Karoline stood at the podium once again, this time at a major conservative rally in Virginia. The crowd was electric, their energy palpable as they cheered for the woman who had become a symbol of resilience. The cross around her neck, now a familiar sight to millions, glimmered under the stage lights. "This isn't just about me," Karoline told the crowd, her voice carrying across the arena. "This is about all of us, standing up for our rights, standing up for our faith, and standing up for freedom. We've made our voices heard. We've shown the world that we won't be silenced." The crowd erupted into applause, and Karoline felt a swell of gratitude rise within her. This wasn't just about the fight she had won. It was about the movement she had helped ignite, a movement that was still growing, still gaining momentum. A movement that would continue to inspire others for years to come. As she stepped off the stage, Karoline's phone buzzed once more. It was a message from the president. "You're a hero, Karoline. We're just getting started." And for Karoline Leavitt, this was only the beginning. As the weeks passed, Karoline's victory in the courtroom and the subsequent media storm began to reverberate far beyond Washington, D.C. What had started as a solitary act of defiance had quickly evolved into something much larger, a movement that had ignited conversations across the country. Every time Karoline walked into a room, she could feel the weight of that moment, the burden of what she had set in motion. Her phone rang more than ever before, filled with messages of support and praise, some from unexpected places. It was clear that her stand for religious freedom had resonated with people from all walks of life. The hashtag #CrossinCourt continued to trend, with millions of posts detailing personal stories of discrimination for religious expression. What had once been an isolated incident in a D.C. courtroom was now part of a much larger cultural shift. One afternoon, Karoline sat at her desk in the White House, scrolling through her inbox when a letter caught her eye. It was from a young law student, someone who had written to express their gratitude. The email read, "Dear Ms. Leavitt, I've always been afraid to speak up about my faith in public, especially after seeing people like Judge Hargrove treat others as though they didn't have the right to express what they believe. Your stand gave me the courage to keep my faith strong and to fight for it. I'm starting a legal clinic to help others who face discrimination because of their beliefs. Thank you for showing me that one person really can make a difference." Karoline stared at the letter for a long time. It wasn't the first message she'd received like this, but each one felt like a victory of its own. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the ripple effect she had caused, the people she had inspired to fight for what they believed in. Her heart swelled with pride, but there was still work to do. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Linda Martinez, the lead investigator from the Judicial Council. "The final report is in," Linda's message read. Hargrove is officially out. Suspension was just the beginning. We're pushing for a full review of court records, and I'm drafting a proposal for mandatory First Amendment training across all D.C. courts. You were right, this goes much deeper than just one man. We're making changes. Karoline smiled at the message, knowing that her fight had been about more than just her cross or even Judge Hargrove. It was about setting a precedent, pushing for reforms that would ensure no one else had to face the same kind of discrimination she had. She wasn't just a spokesperson anymore. She was a part of something bigger, a movement for justice, a fight for the rights of millions who felt their voices had been silenced. That evening, President Trump called her into the Oval Office. The air was filled with excitement, but also a palpable sense of purpose. He greeted her with a smile, his usual confident demeanor shining through. "You did good, Karoline," he said, his voice deep but warm. "What you've accomplished here is more than just a court case. It's a revolution. You've shown the world that faith can't be silenced, no matter who tries to do it." Karoline nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "It's just the beginning, sir. There's still so much to be done. We've opened up the conversation, but we need to make sure this isn't just a fleeting moment. We need long-term changes." Trump's eyes lit up, and he clapped a hand on her shoulder. "That's why we're counting on you. You've got the courage, the resolve. Keep pushing. You're making history." As Karoline left the Oval Office, she felt an unfamiliar sense of satisfaction. She had always been a person driven by results, by the impact of her work and the change it could bring. But today, she felt something different. It wasn't just about what she had achieved in the courtroom or in the media. It was about the legacy she was building, one where people could stand tall in their faith, without fear or intimidation. The following month, the D.C. Judicial Council held a public hearing. Karoline was invited to speak, and as she stood before the panel, she knew this wasn't just another press briefing. It wasn't about the president or the White House, it was about the people. The people who had faced similar battles, who had been forced to hide their beliefs in silence. "As we move forward," Karoline began, her voice clear and firm, "we must recognize that religious freedom isn't a luxury. It's a right. The First Amendment protects that right, and it is our duty to ensure that no one is silenced or punished for practicing their faith." Her words were met with nods of approval and murmurs of agreement. It was a turning point, a moment when change wasn't just an abstract concept, it was real, tangible. And then, something unexpected happened. A video went viral, footage of Judge Hargrove, sitting in front of a judicial review panel, admitting his mistakes. His voice was shaky as he spoke. I never realized the extent of my bias," he said, his eyes downcast. "I thought I was upholding the law, but I see now that I was violating the very principles I was sworn to protect." Karoline Leavitt opened my eyes. "I'm sorry for what I did, and I want to do better." The video sparked a wave of reactions, some praising him for his acknowledgement, others accusing him of insincerity. But for Karoline, it was a moment of profound significance. Judge Hargrove had gone from being her adversary to becoming a part of the movement. It was a step toward healing, a recognition that even those in power could change. Weeks later, Karoline stood before the press again, but this time, it was different. The air felt lighter, and the words came easily. "The battle is not over," she said, her voice strong and unwavering, "but we have made tremendous progress. We've shown the world that when we stand together, when we stand for what's right, we can make a difference." The reporters in front of her were eager, their questions still coming fast. But Karoline had already made her point. The system wasn't perfect, but it was changing. And with each passing day, she could see the progress. Laws were being revised, public opinions were shifting, and people were becoming more empowered to speak up for their beliefs, no matter what they were. As Karoline left the briefing room, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The road ahead was still long, but she knew that the seeds she had planted were beginning to grow. Change was coming, and it was coming because people like her had the courage to stand up and say, "This isn't right." She glanced down at the silver cross on her blazer's collar, the symbol of everything she had fought for. It had become more than just an accessory. It had become her banner of hope, her emblem of resistance. And as she walked toward the future, she knew she would never let it go. The fight was far from over, but Karoline Leavitt had already made history. And no matter what came next, she would always stand ready to defend her faith, her rights, and the freedoms that had shaped this country. One battle at a time, she was changing the world. And so, the story concludes. Karoline Leavitt's journey from a courtroom confrontation to leading a movement for religious freedom leaves a lasting impact, not just on her own life but on the legal and cultural landscape of her country.